You'll be fine, Madeline. You're always fine. That's the whole problem. That's not your concern anymore.
The night my husband of 12 years packed his suitcase and told me he was leaving for another woman, I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I just stood in the doorway of the home I had mortgaged my grandmother's inn to help him keep, and I asked him to leave his key on the counter. He dropped it without looking at me. "You'll be fine, Madeline. You're always fine. That's the whole problem." What I didn't expect was the man standing behind him, Weston Kingsley. The billionaire husband of the woman Brett was leaving me for walked through my front door holding a folder thick enough to bury a career. Inside were flight records, hotel receipts, and a signed document transferring the software I had built entirely on my own to a company that was never supposed to own it. Brett glanced at the folder and said, "That's not your concern anymore." My signature was on that document. I had never signed it. If you're new here, this is the kind of story we tell on this channel. Hit subscribe and stay with me because this one is just getting started. I want to tell you something about the folder Weston Kingsley set on my counter that night. Because it wasn't just evidence. It was the clearest picture anyone had ever shown me of my own life, and I hadn't even known the photo was being taken. Brett was still in the hallway when Weston introduced himself. He didn't need to. I recognized him from the business coverage I'd read over the years, the quiet billionaire behind Kingsley Strategic Holdings, the kind of man who showed up in Forbes profiles as a single paragraph at the end, because he never said enough to fill a page. He was tall, composed, and looked at me the way people look at someone they've been trying to reach for a long time. "I'm sorry to come to your home," he said. "I wouldn't be here if I had another option." Brett's expression shifted the moment he saw Weston's face. Something moved behind his eyes, not guilt exactly, more like the particular panic of a man who realizes the clock he thought he controlled has been running on someone else's time. I asked Weston to come inside. Brett followed without being invited. The folder held more than I expected. Flight manifests showing Brett and Avery Kingsley at a private resort in the Adirondacks the previous March, the same weekend Brett had told me he was in Boston for a conference. Hotel receipts from 4 different properties along the coast, all charged to a corporate card I had never been given access to. And underneath all of it, a document bearing my name and my digital signature dated 11 weeks earlier, permanently transferring all rights to Atlas Yield to Holloway Lodging and Resorts. I had built Atlas Yield over the course of 3 years, working most of it out on the kitchen table in the house my grandmother left me before Salt Meadow Inn passed to her estate. The system could analyze room pricing, occupancy patterns, guest behavior, and operating costs in real time, then generate revenue forecasts accurate enough to turn a struggling property around inside a single quarter. I had built it because Brett's first hotel was drowning in debt, and I couldn't watch 12 years of his work disappear when I had the tools to stop it. I had mortgaged Salt Meadow Inn to keep his business alive. I had then built the engine that made it worth keeping. What Brett had done with that in the years that followed was tell the story his way. In every interview, every profile, every panel discussion at hospitality conferences, he was the visionary. He was the builder. I was the quiet wife, supportive and behind the scenes, present enough to be mentioned, but never specific enough to matter. I had let it happen. I had believed for longer than I want to admit that protecting his ego was the same thing as protecting our marriage. Standing in my own kitchen holding a document that transferred ownership of everything I had ever built, I finally understood that those two things were never the same at all. "That signature is forged," I said. Weston nodded. "I know, that's why I'm here." He explained the rest in careful, measured sentences. Brett had been in private negotiations to sell Holloway Lodging and Resorts to Kingsley Strategic Holdings for several months. The deal had appeared straightforward until Weston's acquisitions team began their due diligence review and discovered that Atlas Yield, listed as a core proprietary asset of the hotel company, was actually developed and owned by a separate entity, my company Everglyn Analytics. The transfer document had been submitted to validate the sale. Weston's team had flagged the signature for verification, and that was when the trail had led somewhere it shouldn't. Avery accessed confidential files from our internal review server, Weston said. Technical documentation, valuation reports. She forwarded portions of it to an investment fund controlled by her family. Brett had gone very still by the kitchen doorway. He wasn't denying anything. He was calculating. I could see it, the same expression he wore in difficult board meetings when he was deciding how much rope to give the other side before pulling it back. It was the moment I understood exactly why he had come home that night to pack his bags. He hadn't fallen into some unexpected love affair and decided finally to be honest with me. He had known the sale was close. He had known that once the transaction closed, he would walk away with enough money and leverage to end our marriage without owing me a single piece of what I had built. The timeline of his departure wasn't emotional. It was financial. I excused myself to make a phone call. Brett started to follow me, and I looked at him in a way that stopped him at the hallway threshold. Miriam Foster had been my attorney for 9 years, long enough that she answered my calls after 10 at night without commenting on the hour. I had actually tried to reach her earlier that evening, before Brett came home, because something in a contract clause buried in a licensing agreement had been bothering me for days, a subtle shift in language around ownership terms that I couldn't quite place. She hadn't answered. Now I understood why the clause had unsettled me. Someone had been laying groundwork. I told Miriam what I was holding. She asked me 3 questions, listened to my answers, and said, "Don't sign anything tonight. Don't agree to anything. I'll call Rachel." Rachel Donnelly had worked with Miriam and me 2 years earlier during an internal audit at Everglyn Analytics, when a former contractor had attempted to claim partial credit for the Atlas Yield architecture. Rachel was a digital forensics specialist, the kind of person who could trace the origin of an electronic signature the way a tracker follows footprints in mud. She had been thorough, methodical, and completely unimpressed by anyone's title or reputation. She was exactly who we needed. I went back to the kitchen. Weston was still there. Brett had moved to the living room, where he stood with his arms crossed, his suitcase at his feet, wearing the expression of a man who had walked into a room expecting applause and found the lights already on. "You knew about this," I said to him. "Not a question." "The deal is good for everyone," Brett said. "You would have gotten your share." "My share of something you were selling without my knowledge or consent." He spread his hands in that particular gesture of his, the one that was meant to look reasonable. "Madeline, you built a system for my company. That's what happened. I'm not the villain here." I thought about 12 years. I thought about the night I sat with his accountant at 2 in the morning, restructuring a debt repayment schedule so the bank wouldn't call his loan. I thought about the properties I had quietly corrected, the ones where his instincts had pushed toward bad decisions, and I had rerouted the numbers until the outcome made him look brilliant. I thought about every interview I had read where my name appeared once, if at all, and his name appeared everywhere. "Leave your key," I said, "and get out of my house." He left. Weston stayed long enough to give me his attorney's contact information and to say one more thing before he went. "Whatever you decide to do next, the evidence in that folder belongs to you. I'm not here to use it against you. I brought it because you had a right to know." I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table with the folder open in front of me and called Miriam back at midnight. By 1 in the morning, Rachel had confirmed what I already knew. The digital signature on the transfer document had been generated from Brett's personal laptop using metadata that placed it on a Tuesday afternoon when I had been presenting at a client meeting across town. By 2 in the morning, Miriam had pulled every licensing agreement between Everglyn Analytics and Holloway Lodging and Resorts, and confirmed that Atlas Yield was without question my intellectual property licensed to the hotel company on a term basis, never sold, never surrendered. By 3 in the morning, I had made my decision. Brett believed I would take the quiet path. He had spent 12 years watching me absorb his mistakes, smooth over his rougher edges, and protect him from consequences he had earned. He had confused that pattern with surrender. He thought the woman who never fought back had no fight in her. He was wrong about that. I had simply never found something worth fighting for badly enough to stop protecting him from the result. Now I had found it. The next morning, I walked into the headquarters of Holloway Lodging and Resorts with Weston, Miriam, and Rachel. Brett had already moved to revoke my building access. My key card had been deactivated sometime after midnight. But he couldn't prevent me from attending, because the asset at the center of the pending acquisition belonged to my company, not his, and the board had the right to hear that before the transaction closed. The conference room was full when we arrived. Brett was already seated at the head of the table, flanked by his legal team, wearing the expression of a man who expected to watch me be removed from the building. He didn't expect me to sit down across from him and open my own folder. I laid out what we had found without raising my voice. The digital signature on the transfer document had been fabricated. Atlas Yield had never been legally owned by Holloway Lodging and Resorts. It had been licensed, and that license could not be transferred to an acquiring company without the explicit written consent of Everglyn Analytics. The pending sale, as structured, could not proceed. Avery Kingsley had accessed proprietary technical documentation from Kingsley Strategic Holdings' internal review system without authorization, and a portion of that data had been forwarded to a fund controlled by her family. All of it was documented. None of it was a rumor. Brett told the room I was acting out of spite. He said I had always been threatened by his success, that I had never been able to accept that he was the one who built the business, that I was weaponizing a difficult personal moment to destroy something he had worked his entire life to create. He said it with the confidence of a man who had been believed his whole career because he was loud enough and certain enough that people stopped checking the facts behind his voice. The board members looked at me. I looked back at them and said nothing for a moment, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do in a room full of people who've been told a story about you is let the story finish before you show them the receipts. Then I told them to look at page 7 of the document Rachel had prepared. The signature timestamp, the laptop metadata, the licensing agreement clause 11 paragraph 3. I told them I would be suspending the advanced analytical functions of Atlas Yield. Effective immediately, though the basic reservation management system would remain active so that hotel staff and guests would not be disrupted. I told them I was filing for divorce that afternoon, and that any attempt to transfer, copy, or further exploit the Atlas Yield architecture would result in immediate legal action. Then I stood up, gathered my folder, and walked out. I filed the divorce papers at 4:17 that afternoon. Miriam filed the formal cease and desist against the transfer of Atlas Yield at 4:22. Rachel submitted her forensic report to the board's independent legal counsel at 4:30. For 12 years, when Brett made a mistake, I fixed it quietly and let him believe the outcome had always been inevitable. I had called that loyalty. Standing outside the courthouse with the late afternoon light coming off the water, I finally understood what it actually was. I had been so afraid of the cost of letting things fall apart that I had made myself responsible for holding together something that was already broken. I had paid for that with 12 years of my name, my work, and my silence. I was done paying. I had expected Brett to be angry. What I hadn't expected was how quickly he turned the anger into a performance. 3 days after I walked out of that conference room, a photographer appeared outside my house at 7 in the morning. Brett arrived 20 minutes later carrying flowers dressed in the kind of casual clothes that take effort to look effortless, and stood at my front door long enough for every shot to be taken before I even reached the intercom. By noon, the image was circulating across 3 local news sites, with a caption about a remorseful husband being turned away by a bitter wife. He hadn't knocked. He hadn't called. He had simply showed up, waited for the shutter, and left. By the end of the week, he was appearing on business podcasts telling a version of events in which he was the founder of a company being dismantled by a vengeful ex-wife and a billionaire with acquisition motives. He spoke slowly and with great sadness, the way people do when they've rehearsed sincerity. He said I had always struggled with his success. He said Weston Kingsley was using me to devalue the company before purchasing it at a fraction of its worth. He said the investigation was a coordinated attack dressed up as a legal process. Avery was working a different angle. She had spent years building exactly the kind of social capital that travels fast and quietly, the right friendships, the right dinners, the right mentions in the right rooms. She used all of it. Within 2 weeks, the story circulating in Portland's upper circles was that I had pursued Weston to get back at Brett, that the whole forensic audit was manufactured, that I was a jealous woman who couldn't accept that her marriage had simply run its course. One of my longest-standing clients called Miriam to ask whether Everglyn Analytics was under criminal investigation. 2 junior analysts came to me privately and asked if the company was going to survive the year. I kept working. That was the only answer I knew how to give. The formal audit, meanwhile, was finding things that had nothing to do with the forged signature. Rachel and the external forensic accountants had been working through Holloway Lodging and Resort's financial records for 10 days when they surfaced the first anomaly, a cluster of vendor payments totaling just over $5 million distributed across 18 months flowing toward suppliers whose documentation was thin and whose work product was either absent or impossible to verify. Several of those payments led directly to an entity called Tremaine Design Studio. I didn't recognize the name at first. Miriam found the incorporation filing. Tremaine Design Studio was a boutique interior design firm registered in Delaware 18 months earlier with a business address that matched a mailbox service in Midtown Manhattan. The listed principal was a holding company. The holding company traced back to Avery. I want to be clear about one thing, because I think it matters during all of this. Weston never once made me feel that his help came with a price. He gave Miriam access to Kingsley Strategic Holdings' internal documentation and then stepped back from it entirely. He came to our working sessions, sat where he was invited to sit, read only what the legal team cleared for him to read, and kept every piece of evidence organized under Miriam's control rather than his own. Once, when I was working late in the Everglyn Analytics office and he brought dinner without being asked, he left the food at the front desk and sent a text rather than walking in uninvited. Brett used to walk into any room I was in and start finishing my sentences. He called it knowing me well. Weston asked questions and waited for the full answer before he said anything at all. I noticed the difference the way you notice a sound has stopped, not loudly, but completely. The night that changed everything was not the night I expected. A nor'easter came through Portland on a Tuesday, the kind of storm that arrives with enough force to take down power lines and make roads genuinely dangerous. I was at the Everglyn Analytics office until past midnight running a manual backup of every Atlas Yield development file onto an isolated server because I had no intention of losing 11 years of architecture to either a blackout or a sabotage attempt. The main grid went down at 12:40. The backup generator kicked in but ran at partial capacity, and 3 of the primary data servers began throwing temperature warnings. Weston called. I told him what was happening. 22 minutes later, a portable industrial generator arrived from a Kingsley logistics facility 12 miles up the coast, driven by 2 technicians who set it up in the parking lot and ran the cables to our external intake, without once suggesting they come inside. Weston called back to confirm the power was stable and asked if I needed anything else. I told him no. He said goodnight and hung up. I stood in the server room for a long moment, after that listening to the hum of machines that were still running, because someone had moved fast and asked for nothing in return. Then I walked out to the parking lot in the rain and told him through the window of the car he had been sitting in the whole time that I was grateful. He said he was glad the servers were all right. I reached through the open window and I kissed him. It wasn't about Brett. It wasn't about revenge or timing or the particular vulnerability of a terrible night. It was about the fact that for the first time in longer than I could accurately measure, I was standing next to someone who had done something significant for me and genuinely did not appear to be keeping score, but I was afraid. That's the honest version of what came next. I was afraid because I had spent 12 years being useful to a man who mistook my usefulness for devotion, and I did not yet fully trust my own ability to tell the difference between a man who respected me and a man who simply wanted what I had built and was willing to be kind about taking it. That fear was exactly what Avery tried to use 10 days later. She reached out through a mutual acquaintance and suggested a private lunch, framing it as 2 reasonable women having a calm conversation. I went. I brought a recording device which Miriam had confirmed was entirely legal under Maine's single-party consent law, and I let Avery believe she was in control of the room. She arrived looking composed, ordered sparkling water, and slid a number across the table before the appetizers came. $12 million in exchange for the full transfer of Atlas Yield to Holloway Lodging and Resorts. The withdrawal of all forgery allegations, restoration of the software license, and my complete removal from the ongoing investigation. Think of it as a clean exit, Avery said. You keep the money, you keep your company, and you stop making this uglier than it needs to be. I asked her how she'd arrived at 12 million. It's generous, she said. More than generous given that the system was built using resources from Brett's company. I let that sit there. Then I said I wasn't sure the timeline supported that characterization and asked her to walk me through how she remembered it. She did. And in the process of defending the number, she told me things she hadn't intended to tell me. She told me Brett had moved money into accounts in her name specifically because he believed those accounts were outside the scope of a marital asset review. She told me the deal needed to close before the audit reached the Cedar Path renovation files, using that phrase with the certainty of someone who assumed I didn't know what the Cedar Path files contained. She told me the offer was coming from funds she had available, and when I asked her to clarify the source, she said it was from Tremaine's operating account. She caught herself after that, but it was already done. Weston doesn't care about you, she said, shifting. He cares about the technology. You're just the most convenient path to it right now. Once he owns it, you'll be another line in an acquisition report. That landed somewhere real. I won't pretend it didn't. The fear I had been carrying that I was simply trading one man's convenience for another's rose up clearly in that moment and made itself known. But I had also just listened to a woman try to buy my silence with money she had taken from a charity account she assumed I knew nothing about. I understood then that Avery's read of me was the same as Brett's. She believed I was the kind of woman who could be managed if you found the right pressure point. She believed that because Brett had managed me successfully for 12 years by finding mine, she was working with outdated information. I thanked her for the meeting, told her I'd need time to consider the offer, and drove directly to Miriam's office. That evening I asked Weston directly whether he was helping me because he wanted Atlas Yield. He didn't answer immediately, and I respected that a fast answer to that question would have meant he'd prepared one. Instead, he called Miriam while I was in the room, put the call on speaker, and told her to transfer full custody of every piece of Kingsley Strategic Holdings' internal documentation back to Everglyn Analytics' legal team unconditionally. He then told me that Everglyn had the right to terminate every existing and pending agreement with Kingsley Strategic Holdings at any time for any reason, with no financial penalty and no legal consequence. "I want to be in your life," he said. "That's what I want. But wanting that doesn't create an obligation. You can walk away from me and keep everything. The company, the house, the system, all of it is yours, regardless of what you decide about me." I had never once heard Brett say anything was mine regardless of conditions. Every kindness Brett had ever extended came with an invisible invoice. 3 days later, Rachel found the Cedar Path records. $2.4 million had been drawn from the renovation fund for Cedar Path House, a residential facility that provided free housing to families with children undergoing long-term treatment for cancer and cardiac conditions. The money had been allocated to cover construction work, accessible bathroom doors, a new elevator, a wheelchair ramp, a communal kitchen renovation, and a study room for children who couldn't attend school. Holloway Lodging and Resorts had been awarded the management contract for the renovation. Completion reports had been filed with photographs. The foundation had signed off on the project based on documentation that Brett's office had submitted. Rachel drove to Cedar Path House herself and took her own photographs. The elevator had been out of service for 14 months. The bathroom doorways were still too narrow for a standard wheelchair. The ramp had been poured but was the wrong grade and failed accessibility code. The study room had not been built. The photographs in the completion report had been digitally altered, overlaid with images from a different renovation at a different property. The invoices for all of it had been issued by Tremaine Design Studio. Every one of them had been approved by Brett. I sat with those photographs for a long time. I thought about the families in that building. I thought about children in wheelchairs who couldn't get through their own bathroom door because the money for that door had paid for someone's plane ticket to Sun Valley. I thought about every time I had quietly fixed a mistake of Brett's because I believed the people around him would suffer if I didn't, and I understood with complete clarity that my silence had not protected anyone. It had simply made more room for the damage. I wasn't fighting for a software system anymore. I wasn't fighting for a divorce settlement or a company valuation or my name in a business profile. I was fighting because $2.4 million meant for sick children had been redirected to fund a life that two people had built on the assumption that no one would ever check. Miriam filed the Cedar Path findings with the Foundation's board and with the federal investigators who had been building the broader financial fraud case. Dr. Evelyn Baird, the Foundation's president, called me the same afternoon. She asked one question: whether I was prepared to stand behind the documentation publicly. I told her I was. She said she would handle the rest. She did. Brett had been scheduled to receive the Cedar Path Children's Foundation's annual Community Leadership Award at their gala the following week inside the Atlantic Ballroom of the Renford Hotel. It was the kind of event that drew local Press Foundation donors and the families the organization served. Brett had agreed to accept the award in person. He believed it would rehabilitate his public image at exactly the right moment. He had no idea that Dr. Baird had already spoken to the Foundation's board, that federal investigators had confirmed they were treating the altered photographs as evidence of fraud, or that the gala he planned to use as a stage had become something else entirely. Neither did Avery. She arrived that night still wearing Weston's diamond ring, the one from her marriage, prominent on her right hand, now that the divorce filing made the left too complicated, because she had decided that the image of a woman desired by two powerful men was more useful to her than the reality of what she had actually done. I arrived with Weston, Miriam, and Rachel. We had submitted everything to the investigators and the board 2 hours before the dinner started. By the time the room was seated and the lights went down, there was nothing left to do except watch. Dr. Evelyn Baird did not raise her voice when she took the stage. She didn't need to. The Atlantic Ballroom had the quality of a room that goes quiet not because it has been asked to, but because everyone in it has simultaneously understood that something real is about to happen. She stood at the podium, thanked the guests for their attendance, and then set aside the prepared remarks she had been holding and looked directly at the audience. She said that Cedar Path House existed because of the generosity of people who believed that a family should not have to choose between staying near their sick child and keeping a roof over their heads. She said that kind of trust was not something the foundation took lightly. And then she said that the foundation had recently become aware of significant financial irregularities in the renovation project that was supposed to have been completed 14 months ago. The room shifted. Brett was seated 3 tables from the stage, and Avery had chosen the table directly beside his, close enough to present a united front, which was the last united front they would ever manage. I watched Brett's face from across the room as Dr. Baird described what Rachel had found: the missing $2.4 million, the falsified completion photographs, the invoices from a company that existed on paper and nowhere else. 2 large screens on either side of the stage displayed paired images side by side, the photographs submitted in the official completion report, and the photographs Rachel had taken herself the previous week. The altered images showed wide doorways, a functioning elevator, a finished ramp. Rachel's photographs showed a hallway that a wheelchair could not pass through, an elevator sealed with an out-of-service notice, and a ramp that sloped at the wrong angle and ended in a crack. Brett stood up. He said my name loud enough that the people at the surrounding tables turned to look at him rather than the screen. He said I had manufactured the evidence that the photographs had been tampered with by my team, that this entire event had been arranged by a woman who couldn't accept losing gracefully. His voice had the same controlled outrage he used in boardrooms, when he wanted people to feel they were witnessing principle rather than panic. Avery stood 2 from the table beside his. And that was the moment everything came apart. Because when 2 people have been privately blaming each other for months and suddenly find themselves standing in the same room with no remaining exits, the version of events they've each been rehearsing tends to surface at the same time. Avery said Brett had set up the accounts. Brett said Avery had created Tremaine. Avery said the completion photographs had been altered on Brett's instructions. Brett said the money had been pawned into accounts in Avery's name because she had asked him to. They were both correct. They were both telling the truth about each other and nothing about themselves. And they were doing it loudly in front of several hundred people that included foundation donors, federal investigators, journalists, and families whose children had needed that elevator to work. Avery reached up and pulled the diamond ring from her finger, the ring from her marriage to Weston, which she had continued wearing on her right hand throughout the divorce proceedings, as a statement of continued relevance, and she crossed the short distance to where Weston was seated and placed it on the table in front of him, with a kind of furious precision that was meant to look like power and looked like nothing of the sort. Weston didn't look at the ring. He looked at me and raised his eyebrows slightly, as if to ask whether I needed anything handled. I shook my head. Brett turned to Weston then, and said the thing he must have been holding for weeks. He said Weston was buying my loyalty the same way he bought everything else, and that I was too angry to see I was being used. He looked at me when he said it, waiting for the wound to show. I said that Weston wasn't rescuing me, that what Weston had contributed to the Cedar Path Restoration Fund was exactly equal to what Everglyn Analytics had already committed, because we had both made that decision independently before either of us had said a word about it to the other. Then I sat back down. Security escorted Brett out through the main entrance and Avery out through the side corridor. They left in separate directions, which seemed appropriate, given that the only thing they had left in common was a set of lawyers who would spend the next several months using each of them as evidence against the other. The gala continued. Dr. Baird returned to the podium and announced that the Community Leadership Award would not be presented that evening. She said the foundation would issue a full public statement that the Cedar Path house renovation would be completed correctly, and that the families currently living there would be personally informed of the timeline. She thanked everyone for their patience and their trust. The room responded with a kind of quiet that felt like respect rather than discomfort. Walking out of the Renford Hotel that night, I felt something I didn't immediately have a name for. It wasn't satisfaction exactly. It was closer to the feeling of setting down something heavy that I had been carrying for so long I had stopped noticing the weight. The federal search warrants were executed the following morning. Brett's apartment, Avery's office, the Holloway Lodging and Resort's headquarters, and the registered address of Tremaine Design Studio were all searched before 9 in the morning. The accounts connected to the Sun Valley property were frozen by noon. Avery's attorney contacted the federal prosecutor's office within 48 hours. She cooperated fully, which in practice meant she handed over every text message, every wire transfer record, and 3 separate audio recordings she had made of conversations with Brett Insurance she had been keeping against exactly this kind of outcome. The recordings confirmed that Brett had directed the creation of the falsified invoices, the transfer of renovation funds, and the forgery of my digital signature on the Atlas Yield transfer document. Brett responded by submitting documentation showing that Avery had incorporated Tremaine Design Studio, personally altered the completion photographs, and transmitted proprietary Atlas Yield technical files to her family's investment fund. They had each spent months quietly building a case against the other while presenting a united front to the world. In the end, the files they had prepared as personal protection became the most complete evidence the prosecution had. The Holloway Lodging and Resorts Board removed Brett from his position that same week. They approached me about stepping in to lead the company through the transition, and I declined. I had no interest in spending the next 2 years repairing a structure that had been built around someone else's ego. What I offered instead was a proposal Everglyn Analytics would acquire the data operations division of the hotel company, absorb the analysts who had been working with Atlas Yield, and ensure that more than 100 employees kept their positions through the restructuring. The board accepted. Atlas Yield came home. The months that followed had a different quality than the months before. Not easier exactly, the divorce proceedings were thorough, and the deposition schedule was relentless. But the weight had changed. I was carrying something that was actually mine now, rather than something I had been holding on behalf of a man who never intended to carry it himself. Weston moved through those months the way a steady presence does, not loudly, not with declarations, but consistently. Coffee left at the front desk when I was working late. A Saturday afternoon in October, when we walked along the Cape Elizabeth shoreline for 2 hours without discussing the case at all, and I realized somewhere in the middle of that walk that I had laughed 3 times without noticing until the third. The divorce was finalized 5 months after Brett walked out of my house with his suitcase. I recovered the family property registered under my grandmother's name, full ownership of Everglyn Analytics, complete and uncontested title to Atlas, Yield the licensing royalties that should have been paid over the previous 4 years and had not been, and my legal share of the marital assets. I took back my name Davenport in every professional context, and when the press covered the settlement, they spelled it correctly for the first time in 12 years. The day Brett was sentenced, he asked to speak with me privately in the courthouse hallway. I agreed to 2 minutes. He didn't apologize for the forgery. He didn't apologize for the affair, or for the years of erased credit, or for building a public image on the foundation of work I had done. What he asked me to do was contact the prosecutor and tell them he hadn't known about the Cedar Path diversion, that Avery had managed those accounts, that he had signed what was put in front of him without understanding where the money was going. I let him finish. Then I told him that what had happened wasn't a misunderstanding or a moment of poor judgment. It was a sequence of deliberate choices, taking credit for my work, forging my signature, selling something he didn't own, diverting money from families with sick children, building a media campaign designed to make me look unstable, and now asking me to lie to a federal prosecutor to reduce the consequences. Each of those things was a choice. He had made all of them. Brett looked past me down the hallway to where Weston was standing near the exit, and he said it with the bitterness of a man who has run out of other targets. "You traded up. That's all this is." "No," I said. "Before I chose anyone else, I chose myself. That's what you never thought I was capable of." I walked away. I did not contact the prosecutor on his behalf. Brett received a heavier sentence than Avery because the evidence established that he had directed the broader scheme. Avery's cooperation reduced her exposure, but not enough to keep her out of a federal facility. The diamond ring was returned to Weston through the asset recovery process, handled entirely by lawyers with no conversation required between any of the parties involved. Cedar Path House was renovated completely over the following 4 months. The new building had bathroom doorways wide enough for any wheelchair, an elevator that worked a ramp built to code a communal kitchen with enough counter space for 6 families to cook at once, a study room lined with bookshelves and natural light, and a rooftop garden that the children on the long-term floor could reach without assistance. Atlas Yield was adjusted to include a new function, free of charge to any participating hospital, that cross-referenced treatment calendars with Cedar Path availability, so that families could secure housing without making additional phone calls during the hardest weeks of their lives. Kingsley Strategic Holdings provided the long-term maintenance endowment, administered by an independent board that included 2 Cedar Path resident families. Everglyn. Analytics grew. I was credited publicly and in the documents that mattered as the founder of Atlas Yield. Not the co-founder, not the supporting architect. The founder. The day Cedar Path House reopened Weston, and I went up to the rooftop garden in the late afternoon. The harbor was visible from the north corner, and the light was the quality of a Maine October low and gold, and doing something specific to the water that I had grown up watching and never gotten tired of. Weston took a small box from his jacket pocket. He didn't open it immediately. He told me first that the box contained a question, not an expectation, and that whatever I said yes, not yet, or not ever changed nothing about what I had built, what I owned, or what I had the right to walk away with. He said he wanted to be clear about that before he said anything else. I told him to open the box. The ring inside was platinum simple, in the way that things are simple when someone has thought carefully rather than spent extravagantly. A single teardrop diamond, and set into the band beneath it, nearly invisible unless you were looking a small blue stone. He told me the blue stone had come from his mother's ring. She had told him once that the only thing worth carrying from one marriage into a new one was something that had already known what kindness felt like. Weston went down on one knee on the rooftop of Cedar Path House with the harbor behind him and the October light doing what it does, and he asked me if I wanted to build ordinary mornings together, the kind he and I had talked about on a Tuesday night months earlier, when the storm had knocked the power out, and we had sat in my car in the parking lot, eating cold takeout, and talking about what we actually wanted our lives to look like. I said yes. I told him I would not be changing my name. He said he would be disappointed if I did it for any reason other than wanting to. He put the ring on my finger. 6 months later, we were married at Salt Meadow Inn, in the garden that looks out over the same stretch of coastline my grandmother used to walk every morning before the inn opened for the day. I walked down the aisle alone, not because there was no one to walk with me, but because I was not something to be given. The vows we made were specific. Weston promised to listen until I had finished to ask before he helped, and to protect the quiet we had built together. I promised to tell the truth even when silence was easier to love without disappearing, and to never again mistake endurance for loyalty. When I look at the ring now, I don't think about what it replaced. I think about the rooftop. I think about the elevator that finally worked the doorway, that was finally wide enough, and the families who got to stay together, because the money meant for them had been returned. I think about how long I spent making myself smaller so that someone else could feel larger, and how the version of me who stood in that courthouse hallway and told the truth had always been there waiting for me to stop protecting the wrong person. Brett and Avery had mistaken my stillness for surrender. They had mistaken my loyalty for a resource that could be drawn down without limit, my silence for permission, my patience for the absence of a line. They made that mistake until the line arrived. And when it did, I didn't become someone harder or colder. I simply stopped standing between them and what they had earned. That was enough. It turned out it had always been enough. If any part of this story stayed with you, if you've ever given more than you got back, or stayed quiet when you should have spoken, or waited for someone to finally see what was right in front of them, you're not alone. A lot of us have been there. The difference is in what we decide to do when we finally stop waiting. Leave a comment and let me know what hit you most. And if this is the kind of story you want more of, subscribe and come back. We have plenty more where this came from. We'll see you in the next one.